October 3, 1945. Kamakura, Kanagawa Prefecture, Japan. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she followed the unfamiliar scent drifting through the narrow streets of her devastated neighborhood. Green tea. Not the coarse wartime substitute made from roasted barley and dried sweet potato leaves that had sustained them through years of rationing, but real sencha, the kind she hadn't smelled since before the firebombings began. The aroma carried notes of steamed grass and subtle sweetness, impossible in a city where every tea shop had been reduced to ash and rubble. Her daughter had warned her not to wander, especially near the areas where American occupation forces had established their headquarters. But Fumiko Nakamura, 72 years old, had survived the war, buried her husband and 2 sons, and lived through 83 air raids. Fear had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The tea scent pulled her forward like a thread connecting her to a world that no longer existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trail led her past the skeletal remains of the Tsurugaoka Hachimangu Shrine, where American military vehicles now parked where sacred processions once passed. Children in ragged clothes played in the rubble, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the destruction surrounding them. Fumiko clutched her worn furoshiki cloth bag tighter. Inside it, the few possessions she had salvaged. A chipped teacup that had belonged to her grandmother, a photograph of her family taken in happier times, and a small notebook where she had recorded tea ceremonies from memory, afraid that if she didn't write them down, an entire culture would disappear with her generation. The Americans had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and the stories that circulated through the refugee shelters ranged from terrifying to impossible. Some said the foreign soldiers distributed chocolate to children. Others whispered that they treated Japanese prisoners with unexpected kindness. Fumiko had dismissed most of it as propaganda or wishful thinking. Conquerors did not show mercy. History had taught her that much. The scent grew stronger as she approached what had once been the Sugimoto residence, a merchant family's compound that had somehow survived the incendiary raids that consumed most of Kamakura. The wall still stood, though scarred with soot and pockmarked from shrapnel. Through the partially open gate, she could see movement in the garden. Her breath caught. 3 American officers in uniform sat in a half-circle around a low table that had been set up on the veranda. But they were not drinking coffee or whiskey as she had expected. They were attempting a tea ceremony. The sight was so jarring, so completely unexpected, that Fumiko stood frozen in the gateway. One of the officers, a woman with auburn hair tucked beneath her military cap, held a bamboo whisk with the careful reverence of someone handling a sacred object. Another officer, older with graying temples, was carefully measuring matcha powder from a traditional Natsume tea caddy. The third, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, was studying a book with intense concentration. His lips moving as he silently read what appeared to be Japanese characters. They were doing it wrong, of course. The woman held the chisen at an awkward angle, her wrist too stiff. The older officer had used far too much powder. The resulting tea would be bitter and thick. The young man was reading the movements from a manual, trying to match the written instructions to the physical reality before him. But the grace of the ceremony came from years of practice, from muscle memory and spiritual understanding, not from following steps in a book. Yet they were trying. In the midst of occupation, in a country they had spent years fighting, they were sitting in a destroyed garden attempting to learn the most refined and intimate expression of Japanese culture. Fumiko felt something crack inside her chest. A wall she had built during the war to survive the loss of everything she loved. Without thinking, without considering the danger or impropriety, she stepped through the gate into the garden. The officers noticed her immediately. The young man dropped his book and reached for something at his belt, a weapon perhaps, but the older officer raised a hand, stopping him. They stared at each other across the small garden, conqueror and conquered, destroyer and survivor, foreign and familiar. The autumn sun filtered through the scarred cherry trees, casting dappled shadows across the scene. Fumiko bowed, not the shallow bow of casual greeting, but the deep, formal bow reserved for moments of profound significance. When she straightened, she found all three Americans had risen to their feet, uncertainty clear on their faces. The woman officer said something in English, the words meaningless to Fumiko's ears, but tone carried meaning beyond language, and the tone was not hostile. It was questioning, almost apologetic. Fumiko set down her worn furoshiki cloth bag on a man-made patch of moss near the partially open gate.
Furoshiki bag, and approached the table. She gestured to the tea implements, then to herself, then made the whisking motion with her hand. The older officer's eyes widened with understanding. He said something to his companions, and they all nodded. Slowly, carefully, he stepped back from the table and gestured for Fumiko to take his place. Her hand shook as she knelt on the weathered veranda boards. How many years had it been since she had performed a proper tea ceremony? The last time had been in 1943, before the metal requisitions took her tea kettle, before the tea itself became impossible to find, before her entire world had contracted to the simple struggle of survival. But the movements were still there, buried beneath years of deprivation and loss, waiting to be remembered. She lifted the chosin, and her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The bamboo whisk moved through the bright green tea with practiced precision. Her wrist turned at exactly the right angle, the motion coming from her center rather than her arm. She had learned the ceremony from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, an unbroken chain of knowledge passed down through generations. The war had tried to break that chain, to reduce everything to ash and memory. But sitting here, in this damaged garden, with these unlikely students watching in silence, Fumiko felt the chain reconnect. The tea foamed perfectly, the bubbles small and uniform, the consistency smooth without being thick. She poured it into the chipped bowl that the Americans had been using, then offered it to the older officer with both hands in a slight bow. He accepted it with a clumsy but earnest attempt at the proper receiving gesture, then brought the bowl to his lips. His expression changed as he tasted it. This was not the bitter, over-whisked mixture he had been producing. This was what tea ceremony was meant to be. A perfect balance of flavor and texture, bitter and sweet, substantial and delicate. He said something in English, his voice thick with emotion, and the woman officer beside him wiped at her eyes. The young man with the manual stared at Fumiko with an expression of wonder, as if he had just witnessed something miraculous. In a way, perhaps he had. In the ruins of war, in the midst of destruction and occupation, a moment of perfect beauty had been created. Fumiko prepared 2 more bowls, each with the same careful attention, each a small act of creation in a world that had specialized in destruction. When all 3 Americans had received their tea, she prepared one final bowl for herself. She drank it slowly, tasting not just the tea, but the memory of every ceremony she had ever attended, every student she had ever taught, every quiet moment of grace that war had tried to erase. The woman officer reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook and pencil. She began to sketch, her hands moving quickly across the page. When she finished, she showed it to Fumiko. It was a simple drawing, but clear. A question mark next to a figure performing the tea ceremony. She wanted to learn. They all wanted to learn. Fumiko looked at these 3 foreigners, these Americans who had firebombed her city, whose military might had crushed her nation's armies, whose very presence represented the complete defeat of everything her government had told her to believe in. And she saw not conquerors, but students. Not destroyers, but people trying desperately to understand something beautiful that they had nearly destroyed. She nodded. Yes, she would teach them.
Each gesture, the way every movement in the ceremony reflected larger principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Captain Richardson proved to be the most naturally gifted, her academic training helping her understand the theoretical framework even as her hands learned the physical movements. She took copious notes in her journal, sketching the positions of implements, recording the Japanese terms that Fumiko taught her, trying to capture not just the actions but their meaning. Major Webb struggled with the physical aspects, his large hands awkward with the delicate implements, but his linguistic ability allowed him to ask questions that deepened everyone's understanding. Why did they use a bamboo scoop rather than metal? Why were the movements performed in this specific order? What did each gesture symbolize? Fumiko found herself explaining concepts she had internalized so deeply that she had never questioned them, articulating in broken Japanese and gestures a philosophy of life that had sustained her people through centuries. Lieutenant Morrison approached the practice with almost religious devotion, seeing in the tea ceremony echoes of the Christian communion he had studied, a ritual transformation of simple elements into something transcendent. He was the first to master the bow, the first to move through the ceremony with something approaching grace, though Fumiko knew it would take years of practice to achieve true mastery. But something else was happening beyond the tea lessons. As Fumiko taught these Americans about Japanese culture, she began to learn about them. Captain Richardson spoke of her younger brother, killed at Iwo Jima, and how she had joined the military to honor his sacrifice by trying to ensure that Americans and Japanese could someday live in peace. Major Webb described his Japanese language professor at Harvard, a kind man who had been sent to an internment camp despite being an American citizen, and how that injustice had motivated Webb to volunteer for reconstruction duty, hoping to make amends. Lieutenant Morrison talked about his theology studies, about his belief that all people were children of the same God, and how the war had tested but not destroyed his faith in humanity's capacity for reconciliation. These were not the monsters that Japanese propaganda had described. They were not the demons who delighted in destruction. They were people who had lost as much as she had, who carried their own grief and guilt, who were trying desperately to find meaning in the aftermath of catastrophe. Fumiko found herself sharing her own story in return. The death of her husband from illness in 1943, when medicine had become impossible to obtain. Her oldest son killed in the Philippines, his body never recovered. Her younger son dead in the firebombing of Tokyo while visiting relatives. Her grandchildren evacuated to the countryside, whom she had not seen in 2 years and did not know if she would ever see again. The tea house where she had taught for 30 years, reduced to ash in a single night of bombing. Everything lost except memory and the knowledge in her hands. Captain Richardson listened with tears streaming down her face, translating for the others when Fumiko's gestures were not clear. Major Webb, who had ordered artillery strikes on Japanese positions, who had killed men he never saw, stared at the tea bowl in his hands and said in his careful Japanese, "I am sorry. We are all so sorry." But Fumiko shook her head. War made everyone victims and everyone guilty. Apologies could not restore what was lost, but understanding might prevent future loss. That was why she kept returning, kept teaching, kept sharing this small piece of beauty with these unlikely students. In the tea ceremony, in the careful preparation of a bowl of whisked green tea, she saw the possibility of a different future. Word of the tea lessons spread through both the American occupation forces and the Japanese community. More students appeared at the Sugimoto compound, Americans and Japanese alike. Some Americans came out of curiosity, treating it as an exotic experience to write home about. But others came with genuine hunger to understand, to connect with the culture they had been sent to occupy. Japanese civilians came hesitantly at first, shocked to see an elderly woman teaching the enemy, some viewing it as collaboration, others as brave bridge building.
Fumiko ignored the criticism. She had survived too much to care about political judgments. The tea ceremony belonged to everyone who approached it with sincerity, regardless of nationality or circumstance. Formerly of Tokyo Imperial University, now unemployed and living in a refugee shelter. He had heard about the tea lessons and wanted to observe, if Fumiko would permit. She welcomed him with the same bow she gave all her students. Professor Tanaka watched in silence as Fumiko guided Captain Richardson through a complete ceremony, correcting her posture, adjusting the angle of the whisk, explaining the significance of each movement. When the ceremony concluded, the professor approached Fumiko and bowed deeply. "You are preserving what we almost lost," he said. "Not just the ceremony, but the spirit behind it. In teaching them, you teach us to remember who we were, who we can be again." His words crystallized something Fumiko had been feeling but could not articulate. The tea ceremony was not just about preparing tea. It was about creating a space where enemies could become students, where conquerors could become humble learners, where the defeated could become teachers. It was about demonstrating that culture survived when people chose to share it rather than hoard it, that beauty persisted even in ruins, that grace was possible even in the aftermath of atrocity. Every bowl of tea she prepared, every lesson she taught was an act of defiance against the forces that would reduce human beings to categories of ally and enemy, victor and vanquished. In the tea room, there were only people trying to create something beautiful together. Professor Tanaka began attending regularly, sometimes assisting Fumiko, sometimes simply observing. He told her that he was documenting everything, writing a record of how traditional Japanese culture was being transmitted to Americans during the occupation. "Future generations need to know this happened," he said. "They need to know that in the darkest time, when everything was destroyed, people chose understanding over hatred, chose teaching over revenge, chose beauty over bitterness." Fumiko had not thought of her actions as particularly significant, but the professor's words made her reconsider. Perhaps she was doing more than teaching tea ceremony. Perhaps she was demonstrating a different kind of courage. Not the courage to die for a cause, but the courage to live for one, to rebuild connections that war had severed. The lessons continued through autumn and into winter. The garden where they practiced slowly transformed. American soldiers, following Lieutenant Morrison's lead, began clearing rubble and repairing the damaged walls. Japanese neighbors, seeing that something positive was happening, donated plants to replace those destroyed in the bombing. Someone found an intact stone lantern in the ruins and installed it beside the veranda. What had been a damaged remnant became a living garden again, tended by former enemies working side by side. The physical restoration mirrored the spiritual restoration happening through the tea ceremony. Each shared bowl of tea, each lesson given and received, was a small act of reconstruction, rebuilding not just a garden, but the possibility of peace. Captain Richardson received orders that she would be reassigned to Tokyo in the spring. On her final day at the Kamakura compound, Fumiko prepared a special ceremony, using the best remaining implements, following every tradition with perfect precision. When she offered the bowl to Richardson, the American captain's hands shook as she received it. "I will never forget what you taught me," Richardson said in Japanese, the words careful but sincere. "Not just about tea, but about forgiveness, about choosing to see the humanity in people you were taught to hate. You are the bravest person I have ever met." Fumiko smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange on her face after so many years of grief. "You came to my country with weapons and found tea. That is also brave. May you carry this practice with you. May it bring you peace." They sat together in silence, teacher and student, Japanese and American, elderly woman and young soldier, connected by something deeper than nationality or history. The winter sun filtered through the restored garden, casting long shadows across the veranda where they sat. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang, marking the hour. Life continued. The world turned. And in a small garden in Kamakura, two women who should have been enemies shared a bowl of tea and found in that simple act a reason to hope that better things were possible. The ceremony ended. Richardson bowed deeply, perfectly executing the gesture Fumiko had taught her months earlier. Fumiko returned the bow, acknowledging not just the student, but the friend. When Richardson arose and walked away, her military bearing resumed, but she carried with her something that would shape the rest of her life. A Japanese tea bowl wrapped carefully in silk, a gift from her teacher, and the knowledge that even the deepest hatreds could be healed.
Transformed through simple acts of sharing beauty. Winter gave way to early spring, and the cherry trees in the Sugimoto compound began to show the first hints of bloom. Fumiko watched the buds swell with a mixture of hope and melancholy she had not felt since before the war. She had learned during those terrible years to expect nothing, to feel nothing, because hope made loss unbearable. But teaching the Americans had awakened something in her that she thought had died with her sons. She began to believe again that beauty mattered, that culture survived, that human connection could transcend even the deepest wounds. The tea ceremony sessions had grown beyond what she had imagined. What started with 3 curious officers had expanded to include dozens of students, both American and Japanese, all seeking something they could not quite name but recognize when they found it in the quiet ritual of preparing tea. Major Webb brought a problem to Fumiko one March morning. The American military government was establishing cultural centers throughout Japan, places where Japanese and American citizens could interact, learn from each other, and build understanding. They wanted to include tea ceremony rooms in several locations, but they needed teachers. Japanese citizens willing to work with the occupation forces to preserve traditional practices. Many qualified tea masters had fled to the countryside or refused to cooperate with the Americans on principle. Webb asked if Fumiko would consider training a corps of teachers, both Japanese and American, who could spread this practice throughout the occupation zones. The request overwhelmed her. She was one elderly woman with a chipped teacup and decades-old knowledge. How could she possibly train others to train others? Yet, she thought of all the tea masters who had died in the war, all the knowledge that had been lost when bombs destroyed centuries-old tea houses, all the traditions that would vanish if someone did not actively work to preserve them. She agreed, but with conditions. The training would follow traditional methods requiring years of study, not weeks of casual instruction. Students would learn not just the movements, but the philosophy, not just the ceremony, but the way of life it represented. Americans and Japanese would train together as equals, learning from each other as well as from her. And most importantly, the tea ceremony would never be used as propaganda for either side, but would remain a pure practice dedicated to creating harmony and mutual respect. Major Webb agreed to all her terms, and the American military government provided resources that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. A proper tea house was constructed in the Sugimoto compound, built by Japanese carpenters using traditional methods but funded by American military budgets. Tea implements that had been hidden or buried during the war began to reappear as word spread that someone was seriously working to preserve the practice. Fumiko found herself with 20 students, 10 Americans and 10 Japanese, all committed to learning tea ceremony at the deepest level. The dynamics in the training group revealed everything about post-war Japan. The Japanese students ranged from former soldiers trying to find purpose after defeat to young women who had lost families and needed something beautiful to believe in again, to elderly practitioners who had survived the war and wanted to ensure their knowledge did not die with them. The American students included military officers like Webb, who genuinely loved Japanese culture, young soldiers seeking to understand the country they were occupying, and a few educators who had been sent specifically to document and preserve Japanese traditions. They brought different motivations, different understandings, different traumas. But the tea ceremony required them to set all of that aside and focus on a single shared practice. In the tea room, rank did not matter. Nationality did not matter. Only sincerity, effort, and respect mattered. Fumiko structured the training with ruthless traditional discipline. Students arrived at dawn and practiced until dusk, learning to sit in seiza position for hours despite the pain, mastering the precise angles and movements of every gesture, studying the philosophy and poetry that informed the practice. She was not a gentle teacher. When movements were sloppy, she corrected them immediately. When students lost focus, she made them start the entire ceremony again from the beginning. When someone's motivation seemed superficial, she challenged them to examine why they were really there. Several students quit in the first weeks, unable or unwilling to meet her standards. But those who remained developed a bond that transcended their backgrounds. They were united by shared suffering, the physical pain of long practice sessions, the mental discipline required to master complex procedures, and the spiritual challenge of approaching tea ceremony not as performance, but as transformation.
Hiroshima bombing. Keiko had survived only because she had been visiting a friend in another city that day. She came to the tea ceremony training hollow-eyed and silent, barely speaking even when addressed directly. Fumiko recognized in her the same death of hope that she herself had felt, the sense that nothing mattered anymore because everything that had mattered was gone. She assigned Keiko to work closely with Lieutenant Morrison, the young American seminary student, intuiting that they shared something despite their different circumstances. At first, Keiko could barely look at Morrison. He was American, the nationality responsible for the bomb that had vaporized her family. But Morrison approached her with such genuine humility, such obvious respect for her knowledge, and such sincere desire to learn that her resistance slowly crumbled. One afternoon, Fumiko found them sitting together in the garden after practice had ended. Morrison was showing Keiko photographs of his hometown in Oregon, explaining how his church community had raised money to send care packages to Japanese orphans, trying in their small way to make amends for the war. Keiko was crying, the first tears Fumiko had seen from her since she arrived. But they were not tears of rage or despair. They were tears of release, the breaking of the dam that had kept her frozen in grief. Morrison did not try to comfort her or tell her everything would be fine. He simply sat with her in her pain, bearing witness to it, acknowledging that some losses could never be made right, but that human connection was still possible despite them. Later, Keiko told Fumiko that Morrison had lost his father at Pearl Harbor, that he had every reason to hate Japanese people, but had chosen to study their language and culture instead, believing that understanding was the only path forward. Two people with every reason to be enemies, connected through tea ceremony, finding in each other's humanity a reason to keep living. The training intensified as spring advanced and the cherry blossoms reached full bloom. Fumiko taught them the different schools of tea ceremony, the slight variations in procedure that marked different traditions, the historical evolution of the practice, from Chinese origins grew Japanese refinement. She taught them about the tea masters of history, Sen no Riku, who had perfected the ceremony in the 16th century, the principles of wabi-sabi that found beauty in imperfection and impermanence, the spiritual dimensions that connected tea ceremony to Zen Buddhism. But more than historical or technical knowledge, she tried to transmit something deeper, the understanding that tea ceremony was a practice of presence, of being fully in the moment, of creating a small space of perfection in an imperfect world. Every movement in the ceremony was an opportunity to practice mindfulness, to set aside the chaos of the outside world and focus entirely on the simple act of preparing and sharing tea. Professor Tanaka, who had been documenting the training, published an article in a newly established Japanese-American cultural journal. He described Fumiko's work as essential to preserving Japanese identity during the occupation, arguing that culture survived not by being hidden or protected, but by being shared and practiced. The article brought unexpected attention. More students applied for training. Other tea masters reading about what Fumiko was doing began to emerge from hiding or return from the countryside, willing to work with the occupation forces if it meant preserving their traditions. A network began to form. Tea practitioners throughout Japan connecting with each other, sharing knowledge, coordinating efforts to ensure that this essential element of Japanese culture would survive into the post-war era. Fumiko found herself at the center of something larger than she had imagined, not through any grand plan, but simply by doing what she knew how to do, teaching tea ceremony to anyone willing to learn it properly. The American military government invited Fumiko to Tokyo to advise on the establishment of a major cultural center that would include multiple tea rooms and host regular ceremonies, open to both Japanese and American citizens. The invitation terrified her. She had not left Kamakura since the war ended, had barely left her neighborhood. Tokyo represented too many memories of her son's death, too much destruction to process. But Major Webb, who would accompany her, promised that she would be safe, that the trip would only be a few days, that her students could manage the training in her absence. Lieutenant Morrison had progressed enough to lead practice sessions. Keiko Yamamoto could demonstrate proper technique. They would be fine without her. The real question was whether she would be fine without them. She had built her entire post-war existence around the daily practice of teaching tea ceremony. What would she be if she stepped away from it, even briefly, decided to go? Not because she wanted to, but because Professor Tanaka convinced her that she owed it to future generations. If the Tokyo Cultural Center succeeded, it would create a model for dozens of other centers throughout Japan. Thousands of people, Japanese and American, would have access to traditional tea ceremony taught properly by qualified instructors. The knowledge she carried, the traditions she embodied, could spread far beyond what she could personally teach. It was an opportunity to ensure that even if she died tomorrow, the practice would continue, carried on by students who would train their own students in an unbroken chain extending into the future. The trip to Tokyo shook her profoundly. The destruction exceeded even what she had experienced in Kamakura. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, replaced by temporary shelters and military facilities. But amid the ruins, life persisted. Children played in the rubble. Markets operated from makeshift stalls. People adapted, survived, found small joys in terrible circumstances. The Cultural Center site was a partially destroyed temple complex that the Americans had decided to restore rather than demolish. Japanese craftsmen worked alongside American engineers, combining traditional building methods with modern materials, creating something that honored the past while acknowledging the present. Fumiko met with the architects and explained what a proper tea house required, the specific dimensions dictated by tradition, the way natural light should enter, the relationship between the tea room and its garden. They listened carefully, taking notes, asking intelligent questions, treating her not just as a conquered subject, but as an expert consultant whose knowledge they needed. The respect surprised her. She had expected Americans to impose their own ideas, to modernize and simplify, to treat Japanese culture as quaint but ultimately irrelevant. Instead, they demonstrated genuine desire to preserve authentic traditions, even aspects they did not fully understand. During her Tokyo visit, Fumiko met other tea masters who were working with the occupation forces. an elderly man named Master Suzuki, who had taught tea ceremony for 50 years and lost his entire tea house collection in the fire bombings. A middle-aged woman named Mistress Nakano, who had hidden her tea implements during the war and was now training American soldiers at a base in Yokohama. A young master named Ishikawa, who had been wounded in the war and found in tea ceremony a path to healing his physical and spiritual injuries. Each had their own story of loss and survival. Each had chosen to work with former enemies. Each had been criticized by some Japanese as collaborators, while praised by others as preservers of culture. Together, they formed a council of tea masters dedicated to ensuring that traditional practices survived the occupation and transition into whatever Japan would become next. They shared techniques, discussed philosophy, debated how much to modify traditional practices to make them accessible to foreigners while maintaining authenticity. Master Suzuki argued for absolute traditional adherence, believing any modification would corrupt the practice. Mistress Nakano advocated for flexibility, arguing that tea ceremony had always evolved and that adaptation was necessary for survival. Fumiko found herself in the middle, believing that core principles must remain unchanged, but that teaching methods could be adjusted for students from different cultural backgrounds. The debates were passionate but respectful, driven by shared love for the practice and shared concern for its future. By the end of the 3-day conference, they had agreed on standards for tea ceremony instruction, a curriculum that could be used throughout the occupation zones, and a commitment to meet regularly to continue coordinating their efforts. Returning to Kamakura, Fumiko found that her students had not just maintained the training, but had advanced it. Lieutenant Morrison had organized the group to build a small outdoor tea area in the garden, using natural stones and bamboo to create a rustic setting for practicing tea ceremony in different contexts. Keiko Yamamoto had been teaching the newer students basic movements, discovering that teaching helped her process her own grief and find purpose beyond survival. The Japanese and American students had formed genuine friendships, gathering outside of formal practice time to share meals, exchange language lessons, and simply talk about their lives. The community that was forming around the tea ceremony proved that Major Webb's vision was possible. Former enemies could become friends. Cultural exchange could heal wounds that military victory had created. As summer approached, Fumiko received news that made her weep. Her grandchildren, evacuated to the countryside years earlier, had been located and were healthy. They would be returning to Kamakura within weeks. She would see them again, hold them again, tell them about their father and uncles who had died. The war had taken so much from her, but it had not taken everything. And now, unexpectedly, she had more to give them than just memories of loss. She could show them the tea ceremony practice that had sustained her, introduce them to the community of students who would become her
extended family, demonstrate that even in the aftermath of terrible destruction, beauty and connection were possible. Her grandchildren would grow up in a different Japan than the one she had known, a Japan shaped by defeat and occupation. But they would also grow up knowing tea ceremony, carrying forward traditions that stretched back centuries, connected to a cultural heritage that war could damage but not destroy. The graduation ceremony for her first class of tea ceremony instructors took place on a perfect June morning. 20 students, 10 American and 10 Japanese, had completed 6 months of intensive training under her guidance. They were not yet masters. That would require years more practice, but they were qualified instructors who could teach others the basics and guide them toward deeper understanding. The ceremony followed traditional protocols, each student performing a complete tea ceremony in front of their peers and invited guests, demonstrating not just technical skill, but the presence and sincerity that made the practice meaningful. Fumiko watched with pride as her students, who had started as awkward beginners, moved through the ceremony with grace and confidence. Lieutenant Morrison had achieved a fluid naturalness that belied his foreign origins. Keiko Yamamoto radiated a calm assurance that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Even the students who struggled technically showed genuine commitment and respect for the practice. After the demonstrations, Fumiko spoke to her graduating students. She told them that they were now carriers of a tradition that had survived centuries of change, that they had a responsibility not just to perform tea ceremony correctly, but to embody its principles in their daily lives. Harmony between people, respect for all things, purity of intention, and tranquility of spirit. These principles applied not just in the tea room, but in every interaction, every decision, every moment of life. By teaching tea ceremony, they would be teaching a way of being in the world, a practice of mindfulness and connection that could transform individuals and relationships. She charged them to teach with the same rigor she had demonstrated, to maintain standards while remaining compassionate, to preserve traditions while making them accessible, to honor the past while serving the present. Major Webb presented each graduate with a certificate recognizing their training and authorizing them to teach tea ceremony in American military facilities and Japanese cultural centers. But Fumiko gave them something more precious. To each student, she presented a small tea implement from her personal collection, objects she had saved from destruction, pieces that carried history and significance. To Lieutenant Morrison, she gave a bamboo tea scoop that had belonged to her husband. To Keiko Yamamoto, she gave a silk cloth her mother had used in ceremonies 60 years earlier. Each gift was chosen specifically for that student, reflecting what Fumiko saw in them and what she hoped they would carry forward. The students received these gifts with tears and bows, understanding that they were being entrusted with more than objects. They were being made links in a chain of transmission, carriers of knowledge that must be preserved and passed on. The graduates dispersed to posts throughout Japan. Morrison went to Osaka to establish a tea ceremony program at a newly opened cultural center. Keiko Yamamoto stayed in Kamakura to assist Fumiko with the next class of students. Others went to Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, cities destroyed by war that were slowly rebuilding. They carried with them not just knowledge of tea ceremony, but a model of reconciliation, proof that former enemies could learn from each other, that culture could bridge divides, that beauty and grace were possible even in the darkest times. Fumiko received letters from them regularly, reporting on their teaching, describing their students, sharing their challenges and successes. Circle of service and gratitude that perfectly embodied what tea ceremony was meant to be. Fumiko, now in her 80s and moving slowly, watched from the veranda as her students practiced in the garden. The cherry trees that had been scarred by war had healed and bloomed for decades. The stone lantern salvaged from ruins stood solid and permanent. The tea house, built with American funding and Japanese craftsmanship, had become a beloved local landmark. Everything she had lost in the war remained lost. Her husband and sons could never return, but something new had been created from that loss. Not a replacement, never that, but a continuation, a choosing of life and connection over death and isolation. She had followed the scent of tea into the unknown and found not just students, but purpose. She had taught former enemies and discovered they were simply human beings seeking meaning like everyone else. She had practiced an ancient ceremony in modern ruins and proved that beauty survived, that grace persisted, that human connection could transcend even the deepest hatreds. Lieutenant Morrison, now a retired professor of Asian studies with gray in his hair, approached the veranda and bowed. Beside him stood Keiko Yamamoto, now a master in her own right, with students throughout Japan. They had remained friends for decades, their bond forged in tea ceremony stronger than the enmity their nations had shared. Morrison told Fumiko that everything good in his life had flowed from what she taught him in that garden 40 years earlier, that he had devoted his career to building bridges between cultures because she had shown him it was possible. Keiko added that Fumiko had saved her life, that without the tea ceremony practice, she would not have survived her grief,
that the ability to create beauty and share it with others had given her a reason to keep living when she had none. Fumiko smiled and gestured to the tea ceremony happening in the garden, the unbroken circle of students serving each other. This, she said, was all she had ever wanted, for the practice to continue, for people to connect through beauty, for enemies to become teachers and students to become friends.